Welcome everybody. My name is Bronwyn Strong and I'm the program director for the Natural History Society of Maryland. I'm so excited to welcome you here this evening to learn about what butterflies and moths do during the winter time. Because you know what? It's winter and that's what they're doing right now. We're so lucky and honored to have Dr. Burghardt from the University of Maryland here with us this evening to share her knowledge and expertise with us on this subject. Dr. Burghardt, thank you so much.
Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes.
All right, excellent. And you can hear me?
Yes.
All right, so thanks for the invitation to come and speak with you today. I will say that I think I was going back through my presentations while I was starting to create this one, and I think it was a year and a half ago that I came and gave a talk for the Lep Club. And in that talk, I was really focusing a lot more on native plants and host plant interactions with caterpillars. And so today I'm going to be talking about kind of a new direction that the lab is taking. And I'm hoping that I will be able to tap into some of your expertise as a community to help me with some of these new projects that we're undertaking. And I will say, with Bronwyn's plug for the community science projects and the conduit that Natural History Society can create, we were able to get a number of folks volunteering for some of our backyard overwintering ecology studies based on the last talk that I gave. So I really appreciate everybody in this group who volunteered to have my student come and do leaf litter manipulations in your yard. And you'll be hearing a little bit about some preliminary results from his stuff today. Okay, so today I'm going to be focusing on an often overlooked part of Lepidopteran life history, and this is where they go in the winter. And I know that some folks, particularly if you do a lot of rearing, you know that this is a very important part of the life cycle of Lepidopterans. But I would say most folks do not usually think about where all the insects go in the winter. They're just kind of there and then they're not, and then they pop back up in the spring and it's a miracle. So what we're going to be diving into today is a little bit of the basic ecology of kind of where they're going and how they're surviving. But then starting to talk about some new research projects that we have going that are trying to understand a little bit more about how humans could possibly be impacting the ecology of these overwintering creatures. So the picture that I posted with my talk on the website initially might just look like some leaves here, but actually I posted this picture because on the left-hand side, you have at least 4 overwintering Lepidoptera that you can see here. There's a number of leaf mines in this left leaf. And then actually there was a leaf tying Lepidopteran over on the bottom left corner, and you can see its pupa that was hanging out in this leaf tie. So just in this little area of ground, you actually have a number of creatures that are using this habitat to make it through the winter. So I'm an ecologist by training, and I mostly focus on plant-insect interactions, as I mentioned. And one of the things that I don't want you to think that I am is a taxonomist or potentially a physiologist. So I'm going to touch on some of these issues that are really important for the ecology of Lepidopterans. But really what I like to think about is the intersection of the ecology of plant-insect interactions and human management of these ecosystems. And we as humans really have broad influence on a number of the habitats around us. And at this point with climate change, pretty much every habitat, even if we're not physically there, we're still changing the environmental characteristics that are part of that habitat. And so as I started working in these habitats more and more and studying plant defenses and the importance of native plants for Lepidopteran as host plants, I really started wondering whether we weren't perhaps missing part of these insects' life cycles. And so I spend a lot of my time going out and actually finding the larval stages of lepidopterans. But these guys don't just need kind of host plants for their larval growth and floral potential resources for their adult growth, but they also need habitats to make it through the winter. And as some of our work was influencing folks to plant native plants in their properties, I started worrying that perhaps we were attracting insects to these native plants, which is great, we're providing resources, but then maybe some of the other things we're doing as humans on those landscapes could be really causing those habitats to become sinks, where maybe if we're managing our properties in certain ways, those insects aren't able to adequately overwinter in these landscapes. And so this is what's really motivated me to start asking these questions and creating talks like this. So the question that I want to answer is kind of, where do these creatures that I usually study in their larval form when they're chomping on leaves go in the winter? And I think this is important, as I mentioned, because we tend as humans to really focus on things that are apparent and mobile. But when we're thinking about the habitat needs of these creatures, they actually have other places that they spend large portions of their time that aren't as apparent to us. And so what I'm going to be talking about today is first, kind of, why is winter a challenge? What are the problems that temperate Leps have to overcome in order to succeed in these habitats? What are the strategies and mechanisms that they use? Can we make some broad generalizations about which life stages are overwintering in Maryland? And then lastly, if we start thinking about life cycles in more human management and urbanization contexts, what does that mean for the evolution of these individual organisms and potentially their conservation? And as I mentioned before, this is an ongoing project that we're kind of starting up. And so I would appreciate any input or suggestions or sources in particular that you know of for some of the literature searches that we're undergoing on this topic. So first of all, winter is a costly challenge for temperate Lepidoptera. This is a picture I took on the Tuscarora Trail, I think, a couple winters ago when we had a pretty major ice storm. And you can imagine that if you're a creature that's having to make it through being coated with ice or on kind of these trees, that's not necessarily a habitat you want to inhabit for a long period of time. And the main reason that it's a challenge for these creatures is that there aren't many foliar resources or floral resources for them to feed on. So they're not really able to gain energy during this time of the year. There's a metabolic cost to dealing with cold temperatures. And you can actually just directly die from freezing or desiccation. So if cells within an insect actually freeze, it can cause cells to rupture. And that obviously isn't good for the long-term success of that particular individual. The other thing that these creatures really have to contend with is all of the birds and squirrels and other mammals that don't have a lot of food over the winter and are really looking for these little high protein, high fat bits of nutrients on the landscape. And so if you're a Lepidoptera, you really don't want to be overly apparent in this kind of context. So what can you do in order to make it through the winter? Well, one thing you can do is migrate, and we'll talk briefly about that, but that's not going to be the main focus of this presentation. But then you have other options. So you could just remain active as a winter insect and avoid the cold in some way, so that you're making sure you're in places on the landscape that you're not actually getting that cold. And there's organisms in our landscapes that do this type of strategy as larvae, pupae, and adults. And then there's other creatures that are using a more traditional kind of overwintering dormancy or hibernation strategy. And we see this across all stages of Lepidoptera. And the thing I want to emphasize is that each of these different strategies has its own costs and benefits associated with it. So you can imagine that if you are kind of entering into a heavy dormancy or hibernation period that you can't come out of easily or move when you're within this, that you can't run away from predators. You can't get away from a predator that comes to find wherever you've buried yourself. Whereas if you're an active winter active individual, you might be able to escape. However, if you're winter active, you may also be more findable. If you're a little egg that's a speck on a tree branch, you might be able to avoid predation that way. So there's kind of these trade-offs that come with any of these strategies that an individual organism uses. So I'm just going to briefly talk through a few of these different mechanisms. This section is going to have a little bit more kind of terminology associated with it, but then we'll get more into examples as we move forward a little bit. So first off, I want to put aside the issue of migration, which is a great strategy, but the fact that not all organisms do it that live in temperate areas means that it probably also is a costly strategy. So when we're talking about migration, we're talking about adults that are leaving areas that are further north and traveling south to a warmer area to spend the winter. And we have a number of creatures that do that here. The largest proportion are actually nymphalids. And you have your, really typical monarchs that we all think about, but painted ladies, American ladies, red admirals, to some extent, buckeyes, depending on the year, all have some kind of migratory pattern of behavior. I actually had a children's book that I got contacted by somebody who was doing an editorial review of this children's book. And the illustrator had illustrated a nice life cycle of a lepidopteran and had it spending its winter in a cocoon, forming a cocoon, spending its winter there. And it turned out that the illustrator had used the American lady as their model organism for doing the illustrations, but they don't actually overwinter as a pupa in the area they were saying that they did. So the natural history wasn't actually matching this children's book very accurately. So it's unfortunate for that particular illustrator. Most other organisms, 50% of them you're gonna learn, do the pupation thing over winter. So they almost had a really easy guess on the natural history there. Another organism that I kind of think is really interesting that does a migration is a fall armyworm. It's a little bit different than kind of what you typically think about. But here on this kind of graph on the right, you can see an illustration of some model results for kind of in different years based on degree days, how the armyworm population spread up across the eastern United States. So you can see in many years by July or September here in Maryland, we are having fall armyworm come up to us. So that's why you typically don't see those guys early in the season, even though they are reproducing. And the benefits here are really that these guys can track their emerging plant phenology and really use those resources when they're kind of at their optimum. But clearly there have to be costs involved because there aren't a lot of organisms that use this strategy, at least lepidopterans that use this strategy here in the eastern United States. So for the ones we're really focusing on today, these are the Leps that decide to stick around in places like Maryland for the winter. And I want to emphasize that these strategies, we're kind of throwing them into these categories, but there really is a gradient, and each individual species has its own kind of suite of strategies that it uses. So when we're talking about these, when we start talking about overwintering, it's kind of confusing. It's like, does it just mean that where they go in the winter, or does overwintering really specifically focus on metabolic changes or physiological changes in the organisms that allow them to deal with these cold temperatures? And so I like to kind of use a definition that was put forward in around 1971 that's basically thinking about overwintering, dormancy, or hibernation as a physiological condition of slowing of growth or arrest, primarily designed to overcome lower than optimal temperatures during winter. And you can see here that there's a gradient of different strategies that all fit within this broad category of dormancy. So we go all the way from quiescence, where we're having kind of like growth that slows just because of some kind of rapid or unexpected temperature change that's happening. But it usually isn't something predictable. And this is usually associated with kind of early season cold snaps or changes that aren't overly predictable. Then we have organisms that go through a ligiopause. And this is actual dormancy. It's kind of a fixed period of dormancy, and it's tied to like cyclical or seasonal changes. And you get both slowing of growth, but you also need nutrient reserves to make it through this period. But in this sort of mid phase, these organisms may emerge at times and feed if conditions warm back up. So there are a number of organisms that use strategies like this that are kind of middle strategies of dormancy. And then what you might traditionally think of as dormancy is really diapause. And this is the most involved strategy of dormancy. It really needs this long preparatory phase that is associated with metabolic changes. And typically this has to be triggered by a non-temperature cue. So it can't just be that it gets cold. Typically it's something associated with like photoperiod, for example. So as the days get shorter, this triggers the metabolic changes that are associated with this dormancy phase. And these organisms that go through complete diapause don't tend to feed at all during the winter. And you really need a strong second cue to exit diapause once you're in it. So that will be something like accumulated degree days or photoperiod, something that really tells the organism it's now time to come out of dormancy. And so just keep this in mind as we're going through some of these different organisms and their strategies. They can't all neatly fit into these categories, but I think it's useful to think about the range of different physiological responses these organisms can have. And the last bit of terminology that I will throw out here is kind of the mechanisms for how these insects actually are cold hardy once these dormancy mechanisms or dormancy kicks in. So Leps are sort of split into two, or insects in general, split into two categories. They can either be freeze tolerant or they can be freeze intolerant. And so if they're freeze tolerant, that basically means that they have adaptations that allow them to survive the formation of intercellular ice. So these organisms are basically freezing, but what's really detrimental to an organism is if an ice nucleation event happens within an individual cell. And what that ice nucleation event means is that you get crystals that form and you can actually have your cells rupture. So what these freeze tolerant organisms do is they produce ice nucleating agents that control that freezing process. And these are different proteins or peptides. And that ensures that when freezing does happen, it's in this protective way that isn't as detrimental to the organism. And oftentimes they also produce polyhydroxyl alcohols, and that limits the freeze damage that does occur. So glycerol is actually the most common compound that is found in Lepidoptera used for this purpose. So some of these organisms can, I believe, be up to like 13 or 14% glycerol by the time they actually enter dormancy. And then the other option is that these Leps aren't actually tolerant of freezing. They're intolerant of freezing because they're not able to survive that formation of intercellular ice. And instead, those critters use kind of supercooling techniques. And this basically allows their cells to remain liquid, but to cool below freezing point. And the way they do that is through kind of seasonal increases in sugars and polyols and the production of some antifreeze proteins. So you can get really technical, and physiologists would probably go much more in depth in this. But I think this idea that these organisms can either actually freeze down to their cells and have adaptations that are probably costly that allow that to happen, or to not actually freeze, but still have to pay the costs of producing compounds that prevent them from freezing at all, gives you an idea of kind of how costly these adaptations are and how amazing it is that these creatures are able to survive the winter at all. So one last thing I want to mention is that we need to think about overwintering strategy within the context of the whole life cycle of the Lepidopteran. So I just want to use the Baltimore checker spot here as an example, because you guys are probably fairly familiar with its life cycle. But it's pretty complex, and I think it indicates how important the timing of all of these life cycle stages are. So just for more kind of new folks to Lepidopteran ecology in general, I'm just going to mention that these organisms start as eggs. So can you see my mouse? Okay, great. All right. So these checker spots start as eggs that are laid in the summer. So this is how you can kind of read this. They hatch out and they go through their first and early instars. And we tend to split up the life stages, the larval life stages, into instars, which are separated by them shedding their exoskeleton. So we call each of those an instar. And so if I start saying that, basically they go through 5 or 6 instars typically before they pupate. So they hatch out in the summer. They feed on turtlehead, which is one of their favorite host plants. They actually go into the autumn as a 4th instar larva, and they enter dormancy at that point in time. And sometimes we call dormancy when it's not in the winter, like estivation instead of hibernation. So here they're estivating all through the autumn. And they do this kind of in leaf tissue on the plant as a group. Then they go all through the winter as a 4th instar larva, come into the spring. Once new foliage starts coming out, they emerge, and our late instar larvae, they pick up right back up feeding. They pupate, and then they emerge as an adult. And so you can kind of create one of these life cycle charts for any species of Lepidopteran that you would want to create. And just in case you're not as familiar with the Baltimore checker spot, because they have been not found very much in Baltimore or in Maryland anymore, even though they are the state butterfly. And silvery checker spot is something you probably come across rather regularly in your gardens. I get kind of an outbreak of silvery checker spot every year, feeding on my Rudbeckia. And they have the same exact life cycle, except they overwinter as caterpillars at the base of their host plant. So that's just something for you to look for when you're kind of trying to find some of these creatures within your own landscapes. But to go back to the Baltimore checker spot, the timing and accurate cues of any of these life cycles is really important. These are timed, and each stage is dependent on the last. And I think that that's a key thing to think about when we're considering the evolution of overwintering strategies, because if you shift around overwintering at all, which stage it is, where it is, you could have potential impacts on the rest of the life cycle. Specifically, what I wanted to mention with the Baltimore checker spot is that this study came out in 2019 in Mariana Abarca over at Georgetown. And they found that heat waves during this summer feeding time that were experienced by these larvae actually had a huge impact, negative impact on the overwintering success of the larva. And that probably is due to putting up fewer reserves to make it through this extraordinarily long kind of dormancy period. But I think it emphasizes how climate change implications could impact both things happening during the summer that these organisms are experiencing, but also ecology associated with their overwintering behavior. So, okay, now I'm gonna kind of briefly go through some patterns that I'm starting to find with which of the life stages are overwintering here in Maryland and the locations they tend to be using. I will say that as far as my research is going so far, it appears that Britain has done a much better job of systematically going through and documenting the life stages and locations of the Lepidoptera. So I'm looking for kind of resources and help here if anybody knows of good sources. So this is the best I've got at the moment. This is a paper from 1937 by Holson. And he went through and looked at 51 pest species of Lepidoptera and categorized which life stage they were overwintering in. So here you can see of these 51 species of pest Lepidoptera, we're really looking at dominant stages of larvae and pupae that are the overwintering stages. Like I said, I'm wondering if a more thorough systematic review exists for North America. Our lab is starting to try to do this. So we would really like to not replicate something that has already been done. So please reach out if you know of some good resources. And even if you know of ones for particular families, we could maybe mine those for information. One thing that I haven't been able to find for North America is a systematic review of, if these things tend to be family traits. And so I'm using a British study here to sub in for that. And in this study, they basically looked at 4 different large groups of moths and categorized where they tended to overwinter, which life stage. And so here what you can see is the Lasiocampids really tend to have egg as being their dominant kind of overwintering stage, although they are scattered across egg and larvae. Sphingids, so the hornworms and hawk moths, they really are very much oriented toward overwintering as a pupa, and you guys might be familiar with this if you rear these creatures. Arctiids are really larval and pupa oriented, I would say, according to this British study. And interestingly, notodontids in Britain are almost all pupa overwintering stage. So this is kind of a random sample of British moths. In the paper that I was reading, they posited that North America had similar patterns, but I haven't really been able to do a deep dive on that. So we're starting to try to do this. Again, if you have resources, let me know. So what I'm going to do is just briefly go through each of these life stages and mention some of the critters in Maryland that use this life stage as overwintering and how they manage to do it. So first, I'm going to start with adults. And this, again, if you'll remember, is one of the life stages that's pretty rarely used for overwintering in North America. And but the real group that tends to do this are the nymphalids. So the commas, the question marks, the mourning cloaks, Often you find these individuals looking quite worn in spring or even in the middle of winter. I feel like I saw one on the tennis court on like January 15th. That if there's a warm day, these guys will emerge from where they've been hiding, which is often things like tree holes, which you can see here, or you'll sometimes find them in sheds or garages. Basically, they're looking for tight spaces in wood to overwinter. And then they'll become active whenever it gets warm enough. Another individual, and these I've just put up some caterpillars of some of these guys to give you an indication of what these look like, because I like caterpillars. And another group, so some noctuids also do this. Straight-toothed sallow is one of the, this is this Epsilia species. They, you will also see in the winter. They come to natural sap flows. So a lot of lepidopterists know that if you want to find kind of some of these individuals, if you're maple sugaring or something like that, you can often come across these individual straight-toothed sallows. Here, I think this is actually a picture of one of them at a wound in a tree. And these adults can provide pretty important overwintering food for a number of different species. So I don't know of these stats for here, but out west, bears often get a huge amount of their diet from adult moths like this that are overwintering under rocks in large congregations. So the next stage that is also not as common is eggs for our area. But there are a number of groups that do overwinter as eggs. And I put this picture of a copper underwing here, just to remind me to say that the reason, probably one of the reasons that makes overwintering the egg stage fairly advantageous is that when they hatch, you can very quickly feed on recently expanded leaf tissue. So if you're overwintering as an adult and then you have to lay eggs, it takes a while for those eggs to kind of develop before they're actually able to hatch. And so if you overwinter as an egg, you can time your emergence to be timed with the phenology of your expanding leaves. And so that's what the copper underwing tends to do. And this, I believe I found this guy in March 30th on a chokecherry. So it was like just after it had leafed out. Other groups that do this, so gypsy moth that you're probably familiar with, they are a non-native lepidopteran that overwinters as an egg mass. Here you can see a female moth laying eggs on bark. So that's a pretty common organism that you might find. One that is going to be very soon out and about, I suspect, are the eastern tent caterpillars. So if you have cherry trees, flowering cherry trees, and you sometimes see those webs starting to form in the crotch of branches, these are eastern tent caterpillars, and they overwinter as eggs, kind of on these egg masses. So when we're giving recommendations for folks that don't want to have eastern tent caterpillars kind of on their trees, we suggest that they go and find these egg masses and scrape them off before the beginning of the season. I leave them on my trees, but everybody has their own preferences. So the cool thing about these guys is, so if you see this picture on the top, you can see these little guys emerging. And this is another creature that is very much tied to the early emerging cherry leaves. They are extremely tolerant of the chemical compounds that are related to cyanide and are really strong concentrations in prunus cherry leaves early in the season. And so they're just sitting there waiting until those leaves are hatching out. And sometimes what you can see here is they've even started hatching before the leaves have unfurled, and they will just like wait there until there's a leaf for them to start feeding on. Yeah, I think that was all I was going to say about eastern tent caterpillars. So okay, actually, I am going to go back. So the advantage of being an egg is also that eggs are the most cold hardy of all of the life stages. So you've got simple cells that you don't have to worry as much about some of these particles that can cause some of these nucleation events to take place. And so oftentimes you will find these eggs kind of out and exposed in a way that you won't often find larvae or pupae or adults. Okay, so another stage that overwinters are the larvae. They can overwinter as either early, mid, or late instars. So all the way from really tiny to quite large caterpillars. Some of them will just freeze and thaw exposed on the bark of trees, or they can find sheltered locations. And there's many different families of Lepidopterans that overwinter as larvae. This is a one-spotted variant caterpillar. This is one of the most common caterpillars I actually find in a biodiversity tree experiment that I work in. And it has some cool life history where it freezes and thaws and freezes and thaws, but it actually provides a very important winter resource for a number of birds that pretty much exclusively use these caterpillars as their diet. So there was a study that was done that found that 60% of kinglets' diets in the winter in Maine are actually this caterpillar, which is crazy. So a really important ecological resource, but also emphasizes how exposed you are to potential predation events as you're going through your winter stage. So another group that tends to overwinter is larvae, red-spotted purples. And some of the other caterpillars in this group have a really cool life cycle where they hatch out of their egg and kind of feed along a cherry. This is a cherry leaf. They feed along a cherry leaf and they will actually create this little frass stick, so kind of insect poop. And they will protect themselves by kind of going to the end of their little frass stick while they're not feeding. Ants don't like to cross it for some reason. But then at about third instar, they will form a little shelter from a leaf and tie it onto the branch with some silk. And if you open one of these up, and then they overwinter in that. So if you go out to a black cherry tree, pretty much anywhere, I suspect that you will find some of these little guys. They're really characteristic in the winter because there's nothing else out there. And if you open it up, you actually find a little overwintering third instar caterpillar. And these will wait and then come out and start feeding on the new growth in the spring until they pupate and become adults. They also will be winter active and feeding all winter. So I actually took this photo yesterday in my yard on golden ragwort. If you have golden ragwort in your yard, I suspect you may have this caterpillar. These are leaf miners. So if you look close, you can see there's little yellow leaf miners that are feeding in between the layers of the leaf, and they will actually feed all winter that way. As it gets warmer, they feed more. They might slow down their feeding, but they are feeding all winter. And this is one of those exceptions that proves the rule. So these guys have resources over the winter because this is an evergreen plant. So if your host plant is one that does continue to photosynthesize and have resources in the leaves over the winter, then you have a better shot of being able to make it as a caterpillar living inside of it.
Karin,
Yep.
we have a question from Rohini. Do any of the Lepidoptera have flexibility in terms of the stages that overwinter? For instance, in years with an early freeze, would a mid instar successfully overwinter instead of the late instar?
Yeah, and I'll talk about mixed strategies a bit more later, but yes, you can. It kind of depends on the species. So some of them, if you're going to overwinter as a larva, you would maybe stop as a third instar and form your hibernaculum like that little red spotted purple did. Or maybe you would make it all the way through and pupate. So some species will actually overwinter as both a larvae and as a pupa. And in some years, it's better to be one versus the other, like Rohini is mentioning. So in some years, maybe if it's a mild winter, the larvae can make it and then they're ready to feed, and that's an advantage. In other years, the pupa might do better. And so, yes, there are mixed strategies as well. Bet hedging, I suppose. Another place that these guys, the larvae overwinter, is in kind of the upper layer of the soil. This guy I uprooted in kind of the surface of my lawn in December. I suspect that this noctuid is going to be overwintering as a larva as well. Okay, last stage that can overwinter are pupa. Many of the kind of active arctiids that you see wandering around, like anaerobids, so things like woolly bears, or this is an agreeable tiger moth caterpillar here on the left. This thing is fast. If you ever see a caterpillar that is moving like way faster than you expect a caterpillar to move, it very well likely might be one of these agreeable tiger moth caterpillars. They're searching, a lot of these wandering caterpillars you find in the fall are searching for a pupation site in the soil or in leaf litter. And that's why you see them kind of walking around the road at that stage. But many of them will find a location that'll be in the soil somewhere. And again, as I think Constance mentioned, many of the Saturniids that are typically reared also overwinter as pupa. Some of them will form structures hanging off of trees, like the Promethea moth on the right. Some of them will be loosely tied in leaf litter. Luna moths do this, as well as sometimes these Polyphemus moth caterpillars. When they form their pupa, sometimes they'll fall off over the course of the winter, so they'll actually end up overwintering in the leaf litter, even if they have formed their initial cocoon on the plant itself. And then many of them are doing them in soil, pupating in soil chambers. So a lot of your sphingids, your hawk moths, they actually will stop feeding. This guy on the left here, I was rearing, it's a rustic sphinx. And they often start turning kind of purplish or pinkish colored, and they will stop feeding and start like walking in circles. And they clearly want to go somewhere, and it's clearly not where you have them in your rearing container. And if you put it outside, it will immediately go and start kind of digging a pupal chamber. And so here on the right, you can see a pupa, and this is out of a pupal chamber. Unfortunately, I wasn't thinking and didn't get pictures of this guy digging, but it's pretty impressive to watch. And that's what a lot of the hawk moths do. Another group, another place that these guys pupate is actually in soft wood. So they will chew out a pupal chamber. And this is a paddle moth. I love these caterpillars. I love this picture because basically this caterpillar transitions from looking like a bird poop mimic into this gorgeous kind of black and yellow caterpillar. And this is like the middle stepchild where it's in between, transitioning between those two things. But this caterpillar is one of the reasons I got interested in all of this to begin with. Because I very distinctly remember as an undergraduate going out and working in the field on a leaf litter study and seeing a stream of sawdust like coming down through the sunlight. And I couldn't figure out, I was like, why is there sawdust falling down? And I looked up, and it actually was one of these caterpillars burrowing its pupal chamber. And I could just see sort of this stream coming down, and it was amazing to watch. This was before the age of smartphones, so I don't have a picture or video of it. But it's one of the reasons that I'm still interested in all of these questions, because I just think it's amazing that these guys are kind of doing all of these things without any of us really even knowing that they're going on. One that you might be familiar with that also does this, and I have more pictures of, is the American dagger. So they also use these kind of softwood chambers, and they take their hairs and form a chamber and pupate within that. And lastly, so that you won't think that there are even more places these guys can pupate, they often also go in bark crevices or inside log cracks. So this, you can see, this is a pupating caterpillar that I found on a tree in Shenandoah last weekend. And this on the right, I was splitting wood, and this pupa had formed and was actually inside the log. I split it open, and there was this pupa inside, intact. And so it had clearly like burrowed into the crack that had formed because it was an old, big kind of log, and was spending the winter there. I put it in a safe location on another log, don't worry. So yes, I think overwintering site is a really important part of the ecology of these organisms. And it is often challenging to find this information. And I think part of it is that there is flexibility on the part of these organisms, and their strategies do change across their range limits as well. But if we go back to this study that I told you is the only one I know about from Polson, 1937, there has been an attempt to, at least for those 51 pest species, quantify where they're spending their time. And I tried to summarize this, and it's a little bit challenging, but basically what this chart is saying is that, you know, if you're an egg, you are much more likely to be on a plant and exposed. And this makes sense because these are the most cold hardy sort of stages of overwintering. The larva locations are the most variable, but you most likely find them on living plants and soil surfaces. The adults and pupae are extraordinarily dependent on the soil and the soil surface. So here you can see the pupae are 60% of the time, they're kind of in this upper layer of the soil, and 23% of the time they're on the soil surface or under leaves. Whereas as adults, they're almost always kind of spending time on the soil surface or under leaves for these species that they surveyed. So I think what that kind of indicates, or at least what it indicates to me, is that the soil surface is really important. But one of the reasons for this is because microscale temperature stratification can occur in these, in small distances in the soil surface area. So this is just a figure showing temperature differences as you move down into the soil layer. And basically in a severe frost situation, you might have -18 degrees kind of at the soil surface, but you go 0.1 of a meter down and you are at freezing again, right? So that kind of temperature buffering that the soil can give is a really important way that pupa in particular probably avoid colds as it is. And there's many kind of other soil factors that can affect this, but I also think snow is a really important part of it. So leaf litter probably provides buffering, but snow actually provides a lot of insulation in the wintertime. And so we can think about as climate change is decreasing snow cover in a lot of these areas. This actually could have pretty large ramifications for the soil temperatures that these organisms are experiencing. So it actually, less snow could make it colder for the overwintering lepidopterans. And this kind of begs the question, like, why aren't all these creatures just burrowing as deep as they can so they can be in this sort of buffered, nice, warm soil layer? And probably one reason for that is that you have to get, first it's costly to dig down, but you also have to get back out. And for a lot of these, particularly pupa, ones that are overwintering as pupa, they are in the, once they pupate, they have to come back out as kind of a soft adult. And so that can be a really dangerous time if you have to make your way a large distance. And so there's probably constraints on kind of how deep these organisms can really go into the soil. Okay, and so this is the last slide here, kind of getting to this point that Rohini asked. I want to encourage you to think about the fact that natural selection is sort of operating on all of these life stages simultaneously. If a change happens in one, it's going to kind of tug part of another part of the life cycle. You can have your strategy change across the range of even an individual species. And part of the reason for that is that different species or populations are basically experiencing different environments, different temperature conditions, and potentially different hosts. So if you have a Lep that's using sweet gum up north and oak down south, then they're having to actually time their phenology potentially for a different host plant. And so all of those things can sort of pull and push at selection on the life cycle expression of these organisms. They can have mixed strategies where you have multiple simultaneous overwintering stages, or you can have plasticity where you kind of shift in between one in a warm year and one in a cold year. So those are all things that individual species do. And there's just an example of this, the speckled wood butterfly from Britain. You can rear them in the same cohort and they will actually expose them to the exact same temperatures, and they will create a range of individuals that either overwinter as a larva or as a pupa. So it's not tied to cues, they just are creating a distribution of phenotypes. And that probably has some advantages, because in certain situations, the larva in warm winters, the larvae are able to stay active and feed and have a leg up, and you can actually get increased fitness that way. So there's trade-offs within each of these individual environmental situations. Okay, so this is the last thing I want to talk about briefly. And this is kind of urbanization and human management, and how we as humans are potentially altering the life cycles of these creatures. And I want to just start by saying that there is a field called urban entomology, but the definition of it is primarily associated with the study of ants, bedbugs, cockroaches, termites, and other occasional invader pests that are found within or near human-made structures. So there hasn't been a lot of focus in general on urban entomology of non kind of pest species. And so one of the things that my lab is doing is we're trying to think about the context of these organisms within urban and suburban environments and human management, and how we can kind of understand the evolution of the life cycle of these creatures to preserve species and ecosystem services and functions in human managed areas. And this is because, we've talked a lot about what these life cycles look like, but now we're talking, and we've talked about how across population ranges, you might be experiencing different environments. But I would say even like where I am in Prince George's County in College Park is going to be experiencing different environmental conditions than a Luna moth that is living kind of not so far away, maybe 30 miles away, but in the middle of a much more rural area. And the reason for this is because there's all kinds of environmental conditions that are associated with urbanized environments that are associated with increased temperatures and fragmentation, but also this active management of the soil surface and above ground biomass. And so we've been starting some experiments to kind of look at these questions of how life cycles might respond to urbanization. And as I mentioned before, there's plenty of different things that insects need. And we've been talking about overwintering sites today. So many of the human management decisions we make impact insects, and how those human management choices intersect with life cycle timing is probably really important for this. So right now I'm going to talk about the removal of leaf litter in the fall, which just happened in lots of our suburban communities, and how that might be affecting some of these creatures. So at least in my neighborhood, there's something like 900 tons of leaves that get removed every fall. And as I've mentioned, these leaves can probably contain Leps, but also they're probably providing some insulation. And this is a question that Max Ferlato, who's a master's student in the lab, was interested in looking at. So he's been trying to figure out what the impact of removing 8.5 million tons of leaf litter from residential lawns might be every year. And he's done this over at the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center to start with, in a tree diversity experiment that's controlled. And basically he put out, he manipulated litter. So created plots where leaves were either totally removed, kind of analogous to what people do in their yards in the suburbs, where they stayed in a controlled setting, which is just pick them up, weigh them, put them back, where they're mulched or shredded, and where you actually add leaves. So kind of simulating if, say, you raked leaves into one section of your yard and then left the other. And then what he did is put up emergence traps in the spring to see what organisms successfully were able to overwinter in that habitat, with or without the leaf tissue. And first, what he found is that these leaves are definitely buffering the soil temperature that is being experienced by organisms in these habitats. So on the top, you can see the added litter treatment. And basically, the fluctuations on a daily basis are quite small. When you remove leaves for this orange line, there's very large daily fluctuations in temperature that these organisms are experiencing. So you can imagine that that might have pretty big impacts on the life cycles of these organisms based on what I've told you before. And what he's starting to find, so he's still sorting samples, but the preliminary results that he have is indeed that butterflies and moths seem to be affected by the removal of this leaf litter. So he's seeing fewer moths and butterflies emerging in the spring if leaf litter was removed in the fall. And for this he's running this experiment again, and he's doing some more experiments to really tease out whether it's direct mortality that's causing that from things overwintering in the leaves, or whether it's actually a temperature related change disturbance. And so what seems to be clear is that leaves are really playing an important insulating role in these habitats, and that could affect both the timing and maybe the survival of some of these organisms. He's currently getting a second year of data here, and he's also started a study in suburban yards. So he has a network of about 30 yards where he's doing these manipulations as well. So we'll hopefully be able to get some really applied answers about how important these leaves are within more suburban habitats. And I want to also emphasize here that we're removing leaves, but then we also are potentially having decreased snow. And so when we get multiple stressors at once, we really could be compounding some of these issues in human managed habitats that climate change is already making kind of tough on these insects. And I don't know, when I came for the Lep Club last time, I mentioned these caterpillars that I was finding in squirrel nests that had been falling down. And so I wanted to give you an update real quick. So I've still been finding these caterpillars in these squirrel nests. They actually feed on leaf litter. So I kept telling you there aren't any resources in the winter. If you are a leaf litter feeding caterpillar, you have plenty of resources in the winter. They're all around. And so I've been following up these caterpillars, which have been hundreds of them are in squirrel nests that I find that fall out of trees. And it turns out that these guys are actually winter active. So they remain and they continue feeding all winter, and they just, whenever it warms up enough, they will start feeding and producing frass and kind of doing their thing. So I've been studying these guys a bit more. I think they may actually be pretty important decomposers in some of these habitats that we don't usually think of Leps performing that role in. So I just kind of want to end talking about some of the knowledge gaps we have. You know, we're not sure if kind of these habitats have any effect on insects. This really hasn't been a place that people have looked, comparing kind of rural insects and urban insects and trying to figure out if their populations are differentiating at all. But it makes sense that it would, because the costs and benefits are likely quite different for many of these different behaviors. For instance, anti-predator behavior could have many different ramifications if you are living on a street tree in the middle of Baltimore, than if you're in the middle of a forest out in Great Mountain or something. We don't know kind of how much of life cycle change expression is due to plasticity. That could be an important thing that would allow these organisms to deal with challenging new conditions. I think there's a lot more room for understanding how our human management activities could be driving selection for these traits. You can imagine if every winter you go and chop off all of the overwintering eggs from the tips of a shrub that you're pruning, that's a pretty major mortality event for an organism that always lays its eggs on the tips of your shrub. And then lastly, kind of what are these implications for ecosystem services and functions in these habitats? And I just want to say that integrated pest management sort of approaches already kind of know that overwintering stage is a really important thing. When we do cultural controls to target pests, oftentimes you have strategies that include leaf litter removal in the fall or pruning. So we know these are actually important for the population dynamics of insects, particularly lepidopterans. Okay, and I just want to put in a plug for the fact that these lepidopterans could also be playing a big role in pest management. So this is a super interesting study of a gall maker on goldenrod. In a previous life, I studied goldenrod. And this is an amazing study from 1978 where they took 5,600 galls and then reared all of the larvae. So these are galls where the larva overwinters in the stem of goldenrod. And they looked at all the parasitoids that they found that also overwintered in the galls with the lepidopterans. And it turns out that they're serving as an important host reservoir of parasitoid species that then attack important pest species during the growing season, during the following growing season. So a lot of our parasitoids that do pest services for us are generalists, and they need alternate hosts throughout the year. And so overwintering Leps like this goldenrod are basically playing a role in maintaining these populations that then allow us to control pest populations during the growing season. So these guys could be playing additional roles in providing habitat for predators and parasitoids. So take homes, winter's a major challenge here. The adaptations that are required to deal with winter are costly, and they involve this balance between resistance to the cold and predator avoidance. Pretty much every life stage we know of can overwinter, but we really here see a dominance of larvae and pupae as the overwintering stage of choice. Soil and leaf litter is a much more important overwintering location than I would have imagined when I started researching this. And I think we need further work on how human management intersects with these life cycles in more suburban and urban settings. So with that, thank you so much for listening. I'm sorry that went a little bit longer. This is an experiment of a first time giving this talk, so I appreciate any feedback and suggestions that you have.
That was great, Karin. Thank you. Do you want to stop sharing? We can all come back together. There are some questions that are out here. I just want to say, wow, my head is exploding with all kinds of new information. So thank you for that. My brain thanks you. So couple of things, couple of questions from before that you were on a roll, so I didn't interrupt. But Kevin was interested again, and you kind of mentioned this if you were pruning your plants and they were on the leaves. What about that? She said that some species may be getting in trouble because they're consumed by deer, and with the overpopulation of deer. He had read about that.
That could be the case. I haven't seen too many studies on it, but I mean, you imagine during the growing season, or even in the winter, they kind of will eat buds, and they'll sort of take their lips and kind of like drag across them. So I imagine they wouldn't be upset about kind of getting extra protein from any Lep eggs or overwintering individuals that are there. But if anybody has any studies on that, I'd be interested to see it.
And Michael wants to know, how do we account for natural selection not granting advantages to overwintering as eggs? Because that seems the most advantageous.
Oh, yes, but there are potential hiccups with the egg stage as well. It can be very easy for it's a long stage. Parasitoids in particular, if you think about when they might find things in the fall, if they find a clutch of eggs, they can kind of hit a lot of them. So parasitoids are a potential issue. I think that you also have to, like I was mentioning, you have to consider the phenology of the plants. And so some of these insects really have particular timing of plant growth that they target. So there are ones that really like bud burst and are really focused on feeding kind of the earliest foliage in the spring. But then there's also individuals that do much better once the leaves are older. So a lot of those daggers are really specialists on kind of older foliage. And so those, you would imagine, wouldn't necessarily be overwintering as eggs, because then they would be having to go through a huge chunk of the spring and summer continuing to be eggs in a kind of a dangerous position. So yeah, you're right. I'll have to think more carefully about why fewer of them are not eggs, but they don't seem to like it for some reason.
And Kevin is interested, are you seeing a line with the climate change moving north, where he said that they had a variegated frit over winter last year in Howard County, the snouts, red admirals, etc.
Yeah, I think that we are in a crazy time of shifts in phenology of a lot of these organisms. I mean, plants are kind of flowering at really unusual early times, and we're steadily seeing some of these species that we would only see kind of migrate up during the summer actually successfully overwintering. And so yeah, there's a Maryland Lep kind of listserv group, and so there's been a lot of chatter about some of those documented individuals. Then there's sometimes, I don't remember about the variegated frit specifically, but some of the other groups, there's also challenges because some of them might actually come in on green industry material, horticultural material that gets, say, grown down south and then gets transported up for the growing season. And so then we see them as kind of fresh adults, but really they were transported as pupa or something else. And so they didn't actually, so it's complicated to know where you're getting something from when you get it.
And then as the distribution of the strategies for overwintering seen in other insect orders, and then to Leps typical?
Oh, interesting. So that pest, the study that I was showing with the Lepidoptera, and they actually have, they looked at a whole bunch of different pest species. So coleopterans, dipterans. So not necessarily. A number of things that live in water, like aquatic insects, often tend to overwinter more in the nymph or larval stage. Like that is a pretty dominant overwintering space for them. I could send the paper. It kind of goes through a number of different categories. Feel like coleops, a lot of beetles overwinter as adults, but they're highly variable. It's really interesting how kind of all over the place some of these individuals are. Maybe I could pull that up while you're asking the next question.
Sure. Jenny was interested in what hollow stem plants should we not cut back in the fall, and when should a meadow be mowed to avoid killing overwintering insects?
Yeah, I think that is an interesting question. And we're only kind of starting, so I can't give you sort of actual demonstrable research-based best practices for Leps in particular, because there haven't been too many studies on this. There have been some on mowing lawns, but where I do see movement is from the pollinator kind of conservation community, and specifically the bee kind of advocates for native bees. And so the Xerxes Society, I actually had it on my last slide. They've published kind of a how-to manual for managing your stems in the winter. So basically what they recommend is let your plants sit over until the spring. In the early spring, kind of cut back the stems sort of at varying heights, like anywhere from 12 to maybe 18 inches tall. And those hollow stems then can be used for nesting bees. And as the plants grow, they just kind of grow over that old material. You don't even see them anymore, but you're providing habitat for a lot of these other creatures. So I like that. I like that kind of recommendation. And I think you will also do right by a lot of your lepidopterans if you use that strategy as well. Particularly with herbaceous plants, a lot more of those Leps are not overwintering on the like high up on the plant itself. A lot of the things you see overwintering are doing it on trees. For the herbaceous stuff, typically if you let it kind of fall down and become a leaf litter as it decomposes, then they just kind of fall down with it. And so as long as you're not kind of cutting and removing wholesale, like you can even cut and leave it, as long as you're not kind of like throwing it into the trash, those Leps will tend to make it.
A couple on the same wavelength here. Clap is wondering, is having a green lawn in the summer possible without Lep genocide?
Yeah, I think it is. I think that you're not going to support that many Leps through your yard, like through a traditional kind of lawn. You will support some, but you won't kind of, there's only a few species that really will feed on those European cool season grasses. Because the mowing lawns, those aren't species that actually evolved here. But what you can do is kind of make that space smaller, and potentially expand some more meadow type areas in your yard. But I think keeping it green isn't necessarily a problem. I think if you're going to have a traditional lawn, then you probably need to remove the leaf litter in the fall. But maybe there's a place in your lawn or in your yard that you can create more of a naturalized habitat. So maybe in the front, you have more of a traditional kind of landscape, but you have a space that you can allow to be more naturalized and allow these species to kind of exist within it. Is that what he was getting at? What do you mean by a green lawn?
I think so, unless, Clap, are you still on? I don't know if she's on.
Anybody can feel free to jump in if people have other comments too. This doesn't have to be totally.
My question really was about whether having, even a natural oriented lawn service is just like the worst thing in the world for us to do.
No, I think as long as there are lawn services now that are landscaping in ways that are friendlier. So I think one of the things I worry about is kind of this wholesale putting down a mulch kind of in the spring. So if you're putting down like 3 inches of mulch kind of around every tree you have, Imagine all of those little pupating Leps that went down and thought they had gone down, I don't know, an inch. And now they've got 3 inches of kind of hard mulch on top. So I think thinking about the timing of mulch might actually be a really important part of this. If your lawn service is not using pesticides, that's huge. And if they aren't cutting back all the dead plant material all the time. I mean, I think some people really, really think that any kind of like it's all trash. But really those are important nutrients that can get recycled back into your landscaping beds. So I've been doing this and using the leaf litter from all of the oaks to kind of mulch instead in the fall. And that seems to be working quite well. And I'm getting many more parasitoids and predators and Leps and things. So I'm pretty pleased with it. But it's a work in progress. Yeah.
Thanks.
Well, and Jen said that she was notified by her homeowners association to remove the leaves. But she took them and hid them in the back. But
yeah,
that's another problem people are having.
So I think one way to do this, and actually somebody in my neighborhood did it and I thought it was brilliant, is to make it look organized. So you can kind of create a large bed around all of your trees. So where you would traditionally kind of have mulch, you can basically create edges and then put all the leaf litter into that. And it actually looks very like formal in a sense, because it's all contained, and if you make it kind of slopey angles, it looks more traditional. But yeah, homeowners associations are tough. I mean, I feel like with meadow habitat and in particular, it's been an uphill battle, but I think that slowly places are coming around, particularly if you think about water holding capacity. So some of that leaf litter can help increase the organic matter content in your soil. And that can actually prevent large scale storm runoff. So you might be able to make an argument that some of that is helping reduce pesticide or reduce nitrogen use, and also that it might be helping with your stormwater holding potential. But yeah, it's an uphill battle. I sympathize.
Constance, you have a question or a comment?
Yeah, in regards to Leps in your lawn, I've raised clouded sulfurs on clover. I've watched skippers lay eggs on grasses. I've raised buckeyes from the narrow leaf plantain that's in my lawn. So there are Leps that will feed off of grasses and clover and things like that. So no pesticides, leave the leaves, all that kind of stuff. If you want Leps, you've got to provide the food sources for them. So.
Yeah, and actually one of the things, you're totally right. I was imagining a monoculture inch mode kind of European grass lawn. Certainly clover gets used, and yeah, there are a number of grass skippers. Some of them will utilize some of the species, but if you're going to mow it super tight, then you are probably going to impact those individuals. So
yeah, kill them.
Yeah, so I tend to let it go a little bit more, and if my clover is blooming, or I guess my lawn is not a monoculture, let's say that. It's moss, it's clover, it's all kinds of little flowering things. So I try to keep it mowed tightly, like right along the road where I might get complaints, but then the rest of it isn't much more. Yeah, so you're right. They are using it, but not in a traditional mowing regime sense.
No, right.
And Ginny wants to know what the best time to mow a meadow with goldenrod.
Yeah, you probably will get many different answers to that question, depending on what species you're trying to kind of conserve. So for a lot of the larger meadow restorations, they're really concerned about impacting nesting birds. So for a lot of the recommendations there, they really don't want you kind of mowing them at all in the summertime. And so they'll suggest kind of an fall mow. And I think that's probably fine as long as you leave the plant tissue. So as long as you're not like mulching it up. So as long as it's kind of, you're cutting it and then it's down, then I think that is probably fine. If you could wait until like the spring to do it, I think that's probably better, but I don't know of, there's a study from Europe that I know of that tried different meadow techniques, and they found greater overwintering when they waited. But some people can't wait, like, because people complain and that sort of thing. So I think if you can do it in early spring, that's better. But if you have to do it in the fall, just try not to kind of completely shred up the material.
All right. Well, this has been phenomenal. Thank you so much, Dr. Burghardt. And I think, Constance, we need to have maybe something on the gardening. It seems to be, or landscaping, for Leps. That could be another good topic to have people back for. There seems to be a lot of interest in that, maybe.
Oh, somebody asked for the resources slide again.
Oh.
Yeah, and if anybody has any materials they want to send me, or suggestions that might have some of this information on overwintering habitat, that would be great. And if you have other questions, I'm happy to answer. You can pull off my my email here.
Yeah, and I think that people are also interested in any community science projects that you might have coming up related to this. So
yeah, definitely. So we've got, Max's study is set up now, but next year we'll be potentially doing some other projects. So
right, and Michael's right. It's alarming what we don't know, but that's exciting. It's exciting too, because there's still so much more out there that we can learn. So everybody can assist with helping move the scientific process and discovery forward.
Yeah. So thank you very much for the invitation, and I appreciate all of you for sticking around quite late. Have a good evening.
All right, everybody, be well and stay safe. And we hope to be able to gather together sometime soon. But if not, meet us back here on Thursdays to learn more together. Thank you.
Karin, can you field one more question?
She just popped off. Dave.
Popped off? Okay, I'll send her an email. All right. Good night.
Sorry.
That's all right.
Good night, everybody.
Hey, I have a question. The membership in the society.
Yeah.
When does it start?